from my point of view, there are 4 or so key promises that the current president made when he was sworn in. There were 4 big buckets of promises that he made. One was obviously what we've been discussing, which is the stabilization of the macroeconomy and the restoration process. We all have to admit that from 2022 onwards, when we had the financial crisis, quite a number of the key elements of the economy went awry. And so some kind of restoration and within that same category, stabilization had to be considered of utmost priority to the government. The second thing that you mentioned was the business and investment climate, where there was a sense that some confidence had been lost in the economy, which is obvious if you've inflicted haircuts on investors. You're not going to expect that confidence will be high. So restoration of business and investment climate parameters such as confidence and sentiment was very important. The third one, if I recall correctly, was about governance and constitutional improvements in the country. Right. And then the last one was job creation, and within job creation, particularly agribusiness. So my view is, of course, we can look at so many other things, but one sensible approach would be to say of those 4 big buckets of issues that the president himself raised as constituting the mandate that he has to improve, on the outcomes of governance in the country, where are we? And I think on restoration and on stabilization, regardless of all the debates about the very specifics that many of us, have concerns about, we cannot deny that stabilization has been more or less achieved in broad strokes. Certainly in the area of inflation, in the area of cost of capital, in the area of exchange rate, some of these very key economic variables have definitely improved. There's no one who can look at the numbers and then look at us in the face and claim otherwise. So on that score, we'll give the president very high marks on the recovery issue. Like I said, there are a lot of granular details that in time we will go into. On business and investment climate, I mean, it's a mixed bag, but certainly certain actions were taken that those of us in civil society were happy about. A very good example was what was going on in the oil sector and petroleum sector, where it was quite evident that some of the actions that the previous government had taken in respect of matters like Springfield and Tallow, etc., were damaging confidence in the oil sector. And we know that since 2017, there's more or less not been a major petroleum development in this country. That's kind of serious because confidence in the sector was pretty low. Investment was not coming in. Very few new wells were being drilled. The new wells that were being drilled in Jubilee and elsewhere were primarily attempts to stem the decline in those oil fields. So it was very important that the government prioritizes restoring confidence in the oil sector, in the petroleum sector. As an example. And one of the things that happened within that 1 year was obviously the issue of the Springfield matter that was still hanging over us in respect of Eni and Vitol and the demand that they combine their already producing field with the green field, somebody's field that was not producing oil at all, and give the other person 55%. That was very difficult to justify in international circles, and it was important that the government works on it. So that was a good development. Of course, there have been issues also within the gold sector that, in our view, have reversed some of those gains. And the black voter gold mine issue is a very good example. There are others that, in my view, have not served us very well. And so we have to balance the two. But given the fact that there was a lot of international focus on this petroleum sector issue, it was important that the government do something about it. I think the appointments that have been made at the GIPC and the focus that has returned to going back on road shows and road trips will also be an improvement. I think the last government did do some road trips and road shows. I myself had the pleasure of reviewing the work that went on in Malta. But I think some of the priorities like Malta and things like that did not really generate the returns that we expect. And we already beginning to see an uptick in GIPC returns, which I think is correlates with some of the decisions that have been taken around where you go, prioritizing the kind of investors that you want to bring on board, etc. On job creation and agribusiness, I think that is where most people will say, it's not too clear. It's not too clear whether we are on the direction that will lead to a vindication of the government's own expectations. We do see that 24-hour economy has become a very broad strategic framework for doing way more than many of us thought was the focus. Because I think a lot of people assume that it was about the night economy. And what is now clear to all of us is that it's not about the night economy, right? It's about value chains, it's about corridors, about integration of those things. You know, they're starting off with the Volta Economic Corridor. These are way more ambitious than we thought. But it also means, therefore, that it's going to take longer to bear results.
I've always thought that that's, you know, it's actually an unrealistic goal to set, a 24-hour economy, you know, project.
Well, I think initially...
Because I thought that that is the natural consequence of how well
the economy is transformed.
The economy is. It's not by a government, you know, throwing up some... I don't think so, really.
Well, so if you think of it about utilizing the maximum capacity in the economy, and you say they are interlinked, the chicken and egg issue. If you don't utilize the full capacity in the economy, if you are underutilizing the capacity in the economy, naturally you're not going to create the kind of trigger which then generates the jobs, which then forces people to work around the clock.
Okay.
Right? So it's a sequencing act. But as you rightly pointed out, that sequencing act has a timeline. How are you going to expand the utilization capacity in the economy and then consume it? And that is what we are now discovering about all this value chain integration work, all this, you know, corridor development work. And it's a lot of work. So the timeline...
This is something you have faith in?
I think they will make some, they will achieve some of the goals because of the strong emphasis on private sector. And if they have the concierge service well tuned. Because you see, one of the things we have in this country is that when it comes to courting the private sector and getting the private sector to feel that, look, we really want you to invest. When it comes to the domestic private sector, we've been very aloof.
All right.
We shouldn't have big, you know, prominent business people being the ones who begging ministers for favors and for support. And we should have ministers actively courting private sector to invest. And that shift in mindset, I think we are seeing it in, you know, fairly reduced context, given that 24-hour economy is not a whole economy. But we're seeing that courting beginning to happen, where, you know, because of the corridor work that is happening, they're having to fan out and try and get private sector to get excited about it. But I think way more has to be done. Way more on the courting of the private sector side. So those will be the 4 key things. I think on governance and constitutional reforms, we have, I think we all know that there was a plan to have the actual proposals for the constitutional reforms much earlier in the year. And that didn't completely pan out. But we have had that delivered now. I think the pace at which the government was formed was slightly quicker than was before in the 2 previous cycles.
True.
And the number of ministers overall were fewer. Good. I think in 2021, we had about 85 or so. That was the target. I don't remember what eventually the full number then came to by 2022. But it was really within that range. And now we're operating with less than 60 ministers. Yes, there are concerns about whether or not other appointments lead to the same outcome. What is the overall cost of these dynamics, which I have myself explained, doesn't make much of a difference. But it does make a difference from optics point of view. If the government president says, I'm going to reduce ministers, and it doesn't, I think that's useful. Yeah, so that would be my quick scan.
Yeah, so very briefly,